Something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. Stand by. From Houston Street onto Elm Street, the Chief Executive of the United States has expired. People running up the hill alongside Elm Street that came from behind the wooden fence. Shots apparently came from the fifth floor of the Texas Bookstore Depository. The Texas School Book Depository carrying a never exercised liability of the Texas School Book Depository. Death and shot.
Of course, you've got 45 years of information, but to boil it all down, Kennedy was upsetting some of the most powerful and violent forces in this country. The CIA that he threatened to splinter into 1,000 pieces, the mafia, which he and his brother were attacking, and we now know, of course, that all of these groups were working with each other, particularly in the secret war against Castro. So it wouldn't have been a big thing to simply take their assassination teams and send them to Dallas. Now, why would they want to get rid of Kennedy? Well, he was going against a lot of the programs that they were all for. For example, it's my opinion he would have never allowed ground combat units in Vietnam. And he even told close friends that after the election he was going to withdraw U.S. troops from Vietnam. That would have curtailed a lot of the profit for the military-industrial complex. He also threatened to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. In other words, disband the CIA. He also was working through his Treasury Secretary to curtail the power of the Federal Reserve System. In fact, in June of 1963, he issued $6 billion in United States notes. The money issued through the U.S. Treasury, not through the Federal Reserve System, which is headed by a bunch of international bankers. I think the two fundamental points about the Kennedy assassination are, number one, who had the ability to strip him of normal security. In fact, when Fourth Army Intelligence called up the Secret Service, called up higher-ups and said, we're prepared to send a bunch of plainclothes agents to provide additional security, they were told to stand down. So who had the power to strip the normal security away from Kennedy? The other point, of course, has to do with the fundamentals of the assassination. If one bullet did not pass through Kennedy's body and strike Connally, causing 7 wounds to these 2 men, then obviously one person did not do the shooting. This is your 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano carbine, made during World War II for and by the Italians. They nicknamed it the humane weapon because it was notoriously inaccurate and you wouldn't kill anybody with it. The bolt is loose. It's basically a piece of junk. The lot that these rifles came into at the time of the assassination was in court in a civil suit because they said that the whole batch was defective. Right in the Warren Commission report, it states that when the Army Ballistic Test Center wanted to test this rifle for accuracy, they had to put 3 metal shims under the telescopic sight just to make it accurate enough to test. All right, I'm aiming at this building over here.
2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006.
Okay. I just about made it in the 6 seconds, but I guarantee you that last one, I squeezed the trigger off. I did not even have this huge building over there clearly in my sights. So I probably would have missed this building. And we're talking about aiming at a human figure 250 yards away, moving downhill laterally away from you with a tree intervening in the line of sight. If Oswald couldn't do the shooting, then we're into a whole new ballgame.
These are handwritten notes that my father wrote out for me while I was at his bedside, his hospital bedside in his home in Miami, Florida. He wrote these out over a period of a couple of days. Wow. Him discussing everything through his lengthy career in OSS and the 27 years he worked in the CIA, and then beyond that when he worked for Mullen and then the White House through Watergate, his time in prison, and after that. All right, well, this first document is it's a very basic chain of command. This is the first note that my father wrote to me. And at the top here, there's a box that says LBJ. Below, there's an arrow going to the next box that says Cord Meyer. Below, there's a line coming from Cord Meyer's box to the right that says Bill Harvey. To the left of that, and underneath Cord Meyer, it says David Morales. And below David Morales, it says French gunman Grassy Knoll.
It's interesting that the researchers have known for years about the possible involvement of E. Howard Hunt, Watergate burglar, CIA operative. But it is astounding that at the end of his life, he actually then began to confess to his involvement. And it's really amazing to me that the corporate mass media has not really picked up that story and disseminated it in any meaningful way.
The information that my father gave me, he talked about the original meetings of the conspiracy, that they were hashing out at two different safe houses in Miami, was for a plot for Miami.
Right.
And the plot, by the time, things changed, it turned into Dallas. I don't know if it was the same cast of characters.
Well, let me tell you something, St. John. Apparently there were two previous plots. One in Chicago.
Oh, really?
That got scotched because one of the first black Secret Service agents, somehow got word of that, and they knew that there was somebody was onto it, so that they canceled that one. The next one was scheduled for Miami, but again, apparently word leaked out, somebody knew something was going to happen, and so they canceled the motorcade through Miami. So now we're getting towards the end of '63. It was the last presidential trip. Yeah. Then you're going into the election year, 1964, which would have meant increased media coverage, increased security. Yeah. So Dallas was kind of like their last opportunity.
Last chance. Huh?
Yeah.
To me, it doesn't have to be the one plot or the other plot or the mafia plot or the Cuban plot or the CIA plot. I think there perhaps very well were several plots that may have not known about even each other.
Well, that's what you would want to do. You'd want to have those layers.
Yeah.
So if one didn't work, the other one might. Plus, nobody knows who else is doing it. Well, I understand your dad said that there was a Frenchman, French Corsican involved. Yes. And it is interesting because we do have documents showing that the United States government had secreted a French agent out of Dallas that afternoon.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I'd never heard that.
And his name might have been Michael Mertz.
Really?
Yeah, I've got all those documents in my files. Again, this is hard leads that were never followed up. Everybody on the western end of Dealey Plaza said the shots had come from behind that wooden picket fence on the grassy knoll.
That's right.
And of course, the House Select Committee determined that at least one shot did come from the knoll. In fact, it's amazing, but the last official word of the U.S. government was that there was probably a conspiracy and there were at least 4 shots fired at Kennedy, but somehow that just has not really been reported to anybody.
I know, and they knew that Kennedy was going to be, elected. I mean, he was so popular. Hands down.
64% approval rating at the end of '63. He was a shoo-in for '64. Oh, and by the way, in the same week that he was assassinated in Dallas, one of the Dallas papers ran a story that said Johnson would probably be dropped from the ticket in 1964. So this not only was the last chance for the people that wanted to get to Kennedy, but it was the last chance for Lyndon Johnson.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. So according to your father, he knew that the power that resulted in the assassination went right up to Lyndon Johnson.
That's right. He wrote out a document that he called the chain of command. He sketched it out for me, and at the very top there was LBJ.
Right.
And below that there was Cord Meyer, David Phillips, and below that there was Bill Harvey. Below that David Morales, and then below that the French gunman.
Right.
Have you seen that document?
No.
Yeah, I have that all here.
Great. We'll take a look at that.
Yeah, you can have copies of it too.
But here's what you have to understand. Johnson, as powerful as he was very much under the control of people even more powerful. For example, in his administration, he had his 16 wise men, who included Dean Rusk and McNamara and this bunch, and Averill Harriman.
Yeah.
And they were. It was written about at the time. They were the brains behind Lyndon Johnson. Every single one of them was a ranking member of the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations is a sister organization of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, both of which were formed out of the old Cecil Rhodes Roundtable groups. These are the royalty, the banking elite of Europe, of the world, and then they came over here. They were the ones who tried to instigate the League of Nations in World War I, but we didn't want to give up our sovereignty. So then they formed the Council on Foreign Relations, specifically with the goal of educating the American people to why we needed to be part of a United Nations. These are the globalists. These are the people that George Bush Sr. referred to as the New World Order.
Okay. Tell me about Sam Rayburn.
Well, Sam Rayburn was the Speaker of the House, and he was the mentor of Lyndon Johnson.
Oh, okay.
And the famous story is that when Kennedy got the nomination at the Democratic National Committee a convention, that Johnson was so mad he stomped off the stage, and Sam Rayburn went after him and said, "Come on, Lyndon, get back, play the game, go along, you'll get your chance." Okay. So Lyndon came back in, and of course Kennedy then, to try to mend fences in the Democratic Party, offered the vice presidency to Johnson, never thinking for a minute that he'd take this powerless job when he was the most powerful senator on the Hill. And to the surprise of both Kennedy and Johnson's people, Johnson accepted the vice president's nomination. And later, when he was asked, "Why'd you do that?" he said, "Well, it put me one step closer to the presidency."
Isn't that prophetic?
Yeah, and it also showed his ambition. H.L. Hunt had put out and ran an ad in the Dallas newspapers charging Kennedy with treason. And so you can see that among the wealthy elite of this country, they not only hated him, they viewed him as a traitor and a criminal. And of course, there were violent factions ready to take action once it was understood that nothing would be done to them. Years ago, one of the earliest researchers, Penn Jones, told me that he had learned from servants and people attending the meeting that there had been a meeting at a oil man's house the night before the assassination, and present there was Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, J. Edgar Hoover, and he styled it as a last-minute commanders meeting. Later years, I met Madeline Brown, who was a mistress, a girlfriend to Lyndon Johnson, and she told me she had been at that meeting and that Johnson had arrived a little late, and he and Hoover and Nixon and the oil men had all gone into another room. And when they came out of that room, that Johnson whispered to her and said, "Well, I'll tell you one thing, those goddamn Kennedys will never bother me again after tomorrow." And that came from Madeline Brown, and I can assure you that she was Lyndon Johnson's girlfriend.
Well, it's a tragedy, really, for me. On a deeper personal level. What this location represents to me is not only, obviously on a national level and an international level, but on a deeply personal level, it's caused an incredible amount of heartache and sadness in my family.
Do you feel like your father, towards the end, felt any regrets?
No. I think he died without having, well, as a matter of fact, he told me the only regrets that he had, and he was very sick when he told me this, very close to death, and I was, he paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts, and at that moment I was thinking, did he have regrets about his wife being murdered, about his children being, his family being destroyed? And no, it wasn't those things. It was that the Bay of Pigs had not been successful. So that's the kind of guy my dad was.
And keep in mind, those people that were involved with the Bay of Pigs, and when it failed, who did they blame? Kennedy.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
They blamed Kennedy. Yeah. And yet, when you really go look at the dig down into the Bay of Pigs, you find out that Kennedy wasn't even aware that was going to happen until after he got elected.
Right. That was
planned by Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
Who was the White House political action officer of Eisenhower.
That's right.
Right? So it was a fait accompli.
Yes.
It was already going to happen, and yet when it failed, Kennedy took the responsibility for
Yeah,
it.
not Nixon. With Nixon, his history with my dad goes back to the Bay of Pigs days. So when he was made aware that E. Howard Hunt was working in a team for him, I mean, I don't know when he was made aware of that, but I know that Charles Colson brought him in, to become what was eventually called the Plumbers unit.
So when it was time to form the Plumbers and start what came to be known as Watergate, he was glad to get E. Howard Hunt on his team. Right?
Yeah, well, he knew E. Howard Hunt could take care of things. That's why I also, on the other side of that same coin, he was very worried about my dad, because that Hunt knows too much.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's a Watergate Nixon transcript tape.
Yeah. And of course, all through those Watergate tapes in the White House, he kept referring to that whole Bay of Pigs thing. And of course, by then, now it's 1974. Everybody knew about the Bay of Pigs. H.R. Haldeman said he finally came to understand that when Nixon was concerned about that whole Bay of Pigs thing, that was a code word for the Kennedy assassination.
That's right.
When you get into people, say, look, the problem is that this is the whole Bay of Pigs thing, and the president just feels that without going into details, don't lie to them, but he can't say it from a bottom flip. You can say, this is our comedy of errors, this is our hell without getting into it. The president is going to believe that this is the whole Bay of Pigs thing up again. And because these people are fighting for peace, and they should call the FBI and push the country to don't go any further into this case, period. That's what our names are. This is Hunt, that'll uncover a lot of legal and scandals, a lot of things, and then we just deal with this. It'd be very detrimental to have this thing go any further. This involves the Cubans and a lot of hanky-panky that we have nothing to do with ourselves. What the hell did Mitchell know about this thing? I think so. I don't think he knew the details, but I think he didn't know how.
Well, I'll even go this far. I think the people who planned and executed the Kennedy assassination looked upon themselves as patriots. They felt like they were saving this country from international communism. What they didn't understand was that the same international banking oligarchy that was controlling the United States were the same folks that created communism. People have always said to me, well, hey, if there's a conspiracy, wouldn't someone have talked? Hey, they've all talked. You got James Fowles, who said, yeah, I did it. You got the documents coming out about the French Corsicans that was secreted out of Dallas the day of the assassination. You've got the Warren Commission. I've got a document there where they said, well, we looked into Oswald's background, but this is going to take some serious omission and redaction. In other words, editing. In other words, we're not going to tell everybody the truth about what his background was, and they've all talked. Everybody's talked.
It's very cathartic, to get all this out. It's very empowering to know that that my father put me in the position to give this information to the public, something that he could not do in his life. And when he said to me, when he gave me this information and said that he wanted me to release this after he died. I carried this kind of monster on my back, for the last couple of years, and it feels very empowering and very good to get this out.
To splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. In other words, disband the CIA. He also was working through his Treasury Secretary to curtail the power of the Federal Reserve System. In fact, in June of 1963, he issued $6 billion in United States notes. Money issued through the U.S. Treasury, not through the Federal Reserve System, which is headed by a bunch of international bankers. I think the two fundamental points about the Kennedy assassination are, number one, who had the ability to strip him of normal security. In fact, when Fourth Army Intelligence called up the Secret Service, called up higher-ups and said, we're prepared to send a bunch of plainclothes agents to provide additional security. got 45 years of information, but to boil it all down, Kennedy was upsetting some of the most powerful and violent forces in this country. The CIA, that he threatened to splinter into 1,000 pieces.
President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The president is dead. Something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. Stand by. From Houston Street onto Elm Street, the chief executive of the United States has expired. People running up the hill alongside Elm Street that came from behind the wooden fence. Shots apparently came from the fifth floor of the Texas Bookstore Depository.
Security, they were told to stand down. So who had the power to strip the normal security away from Kennedy? The other point, of course, has to do with the fundamentals of the assassination. If one bullet did not pass through Kennedy's body and strike Connally, causing 7 wounds to these 2 men, then obviously one person did not do the shooting. This is your 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano carbine, made during World War II for and by the Italians. They nicknamed it the humane weapon because it was notoriously inaccurate and you wouldn't kill anybody with it. The bolt is loose. It's basically a piece of junk. The mafia, which he and his brother were attacking, and we now know, of course, that all of these groups were working with each other, particularly in the secret war against Castro. So it wouldn't have been a big thing to simply take their assassination teams and send them to Dallas. Now, why would they want to get rid of Kennedy? Well, he was going against a lot of the programs that they were all for. For example, it's my opinion he would have never allowed ground combat units in Vietnam. And he even told close friends that after the election he was going to withdraw U.S. troops from Vietnam. That would have curtailed a lot of the profit for the military-industrial complex. He also threatened